Let's get rolling. So again, I'm Brady Harrison, and we're here for Zero UI, the War of the Machine wallet in agentic commerce. A little background, I work at Equifax. I lead the strategy and execution function within the global fraud and identity business. And so that's M&A. What does the future 2 years in front of us look like from identity, payments, which is topical today, chargebacks, also topical, as well as compliance. And so that would be, looking for bad actors, terrorists, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. So we're really going to be focused on the kind of payments and chargebacks today. But quick raise of hands, who has done an agentic commerce transaction? Zero, not surprising. I think that will come later when we talk about what is this thing? Is it really real or not? First will be an agentic commerce overview, talk about agents and the rise of the two-tier internet, really the 4 stages of the agentic autonomy, like where we are, where we could go. You can join Mike Taylor for his doomsday clock later. Like, where do you feel on this spectrum? Kind of the identity crisis in bots, like how do we kind of manage this from a fraud and identity perspective? And then really closing with, what does that mean for a chargeback? I.e., when fraud happens with one of these agentic, how does that break the kind of existing regulatory and rules environment that we've set up for going on 60 plus years? Credit cards are from the 1960s, and the technology from a payments perspective has evolved pretty rapidly. But on the back end, the regulatory side has not changed that much. And so what happens when technology kind of breaks a legal dispute process that was, really even pre-computer? And so we'll go through that and then some Q&A. So what is agentic commerce overall? So no one has done an agentic transaction. Can anyone surmise? Has anyone used an AI agent for anything? Okay, yeah, that tracks with kind of where I think most people are. So really what agentic commerce is an automated and delegated purchasing via an AI agent. And so that really means nose to tail. So I say AI agent, hey, I want this thing. I need you to execute that fully and totally. And so there's a bit of a definitional crisis. I'm on the board of the Merchant Risk Council, which is an industry and merchant cooperative organization that's been around for 25 years. And this is a huge topic of discussion is well, what is it? So I was in Vegas a couple of weeks ago for our board meeting, and we talked about this for quite a while of well, what is agentic commerce? Is it agentic commerce if I get everything up until the purchase? Does it have to go through the purchase? And so that's what we'll talk about in a moment. But really, today we're on kind of the right-hand side of this of it's really a human readable search engine optimized graphical user interface where I go to a page, I do discovery via scrolling and human interaction, and then I make a purchase. And behind the scenes, there's a lot of interesting technology of making that purchase happen. Who do I use for routing for that individual purpose? So there's a lot of hidden complexity from a cost perspective behind there, but all of that is fairly opaque to the user. What could be tomorrow is if you are somewhat experienced with how these AI agents work, it's pretty computationally expensive to read a graphical user interface, try to make a decision and make a purchase. All the tech people in the room would much prefer the other side of the graph, which is really a JSON object of here's what's on the page, here's the availability, here's the price, color. This is where an agent's preferred mode of interacting with a page is vastly different than a human. If you were on the internet really early, that zero UI probably makes sense because that's kind of what things were, where you're in the DOS command line. But we've had this shift to the other side where it's a graphical user interface where people are really optimizing for ads and scrolling. And so for an agent, it's probably not going to read an ad, and it may have a hard time distinguishing between specific greens or your green and my green. Philosophy 101 question may be slightly different. And so, but if you can tell it this is green and it's this exact hexadecimal code, it's I know what green that is. And I can kind of guess that this is the right green. And so the challenge here is we're really set up for the graphical user side. Companies are really set up for the other side, but it's kind of a mismatch of where we'll get to eventually and what that means for advertising and who are we optimizing for on the internet. Is it my experience as a user, or is it the Claude bot's experience as a crawling agent's experience? Like if I'm a business, what am I optimizing for overall, and what traffic do I want to drive? And depending on who you listen to, we could be, 90% of traffic is going to be agentic in like 2 years and search engine optimization is dead. Or much like this room, no agentic transactions. And so like we're having this balance of like everyone is talking about agentic commerce and we need to be prepared and what are we doing? And then you ask people and they're like, oh yeah, I've never done one. I don't know anyone who's ever done one and I don't see it as an option. So I will admit I'm a little bit of a skeptic, but I think there's some really interesting things to think about when it comes to what this will do to the internet. And so really it's kind of splitting that. Is anyone familiar with the internet inversion? It's this theory that the majority of the traffic online starting in like 2014 is not a person. And so pre-2014, the majority of the traffic is a human being making some request of a website or channel and creating events. Post 2014, 2012, depending on who you ask, we have an inversion where the majority of the traffic is actually automated. That's crawlers, bots, right? That kind of robot.txt of all these search engines. The theory is that once this shifts, we have now started optimizing inadvertently for bot traffic versus human traffic because they are somewhat hard to distinguish. And so when we change this and we start actually making purchases that are good transaction, it leads to some odd, stuff happening. And so on the agentic web, it's really optimized for JSONs and speed, where we could actually have a faster, less interesting internet because images are not really as material. A description of an image kind of shortcuts that process. And if I want bots to purchase from me, I can lower the cost of tokens by having all the stuff that agent already needs versus letting it say, okay, go to the page, look at the image, spend 10,000 tokens analyzing the image, and then produce a readable output of what that image is. If I can just tell you what the image is, then we could shortcut that process. And so then we'll start to see potentially more optimizing for that. But as we get to the end, we'll talk about what are the financial incentives for actual merchants on the end of this? Is that really what they're going to be optimizing for? And it depends on what the OpenAIs and Geminis of the world kind of decide for who are we looking to, enrich in this process. And we'll see kind of a downgrade of the human web, right? As if 90% of the traffic is agents, I would probably devote more of my energy to that digital discovery and optimization for agents versus people. Similar to how the SEO revolution really changed what websites look like, we may see the geo or generative AI engine optimization become the predominant method of what we're optimizing for online. And so humans could become potentially second-class citizens on the internet. A big part of that is these AI agents and their synthetic derivatives. It used to be that you would have an agent do one thing. And now agents are sophisticated enough that they can spin up their own derivatives and say, hey, I'm not going to have one process that does all of this. I might have 10 processes all running in parallel where agents are spinning up agents of their own to do, sub work. And so rather than it's connecting user and intent, it's really a request and execute model. So I'm trying to figure out what's happening. I actually make a request and it says, go execute on this transaction. And so I'm a big user of agentic AI tools. I think the commerce stuff is maybe a little further out. Great example. I like to rock climb, as all skinny, tall guys are like, oh my God, this is for me. This is perfectly, talk about match fit quality. This is for me. And so I need a new harness. And so the agentic world, I was I don't really know a ton about this or really what I want. I'm not that particular. So I said, hey, Gemini, spin up an agent. I want you to do these things. Find a harness that's available at REI, because I'm about the rewards and the points. I need it to be less than this dollar value. I want primarily gym climbing, and I don't carry trad gear, so I don't really care about all the extras, and I want it to be less than like $150. It executed on that, spun up some derivatives to say, okay, go what's available at REI, go find reviews at REI and otherwise to dig into that transaction. And then the interesting bit, it actually presented me with the options for purchase. And so eagle-eyed people in the room will know that I actually did not make this purchase. I had a human agent go figure that out for me, that I said, this is the one that I need, my wife. The ultimate delegated agent task. But I did everything until clicking the purchase button, which I think is most, raise of hands, who's done an agentic shopping interaction where I need some research or detail. That I think will be the predominant method, but the human being is still gonna set that ultimate next step. And so now that we've seen this inversion is potentially accelerating and all the discovery, research, analysis is going to be agent driven, that may change what websites look like. Ultimately, from a purchasing standpoint, we want to click the easy button, but having that process get easier and easier and easier. I don't think there's a ton of optimization there from an agent based on where the agent stages are today, but that may change, right? And so really, I was in the AI initiate. So there are really 4 stages of agentic autonomy. Like, what is the agent actually doing? And so today, a lot of people are in this AI recommends. It's a smart advisor. It asks those, it says, hey, I will advise and tell you what you need to purchase here, right? And so any kinds of purchase you would make, you would probably, anybody who's using agents is probably gonna look through these individual items. This is like the base case level of the LLM technology, like collapse a bunch of data into like a universe and then predict potentially the next option and kind of do the reading in between. And so that would be where it's a smart search engine, right? I can collate and personalize recommendations based on what it knows about me, and then could actually provide, a little more granular detail that I don't necessarily directly prompt it with. And so in that prior example, it may say, hey, I'm only gonna look at the REI store in Boise because maybe I know that he wants it today, or he knows XYZ about this transaction, and then I may subdivide, like he doesn't like red, he never buys red stuff. Whenever he uploads photos to do something, nothing is red. And so it may do some unprompted analysis that could come up. And that's quite interesting as we get into these personalization modes. I'm a big Gemini user. They do have a function where you actually share your email and calendar natively with Gemini. I am not quite at that point, but it could be interesting as we get to the next level where AI actually initiates. I'm not requesting and prompting for individual research or purchases. This is where we get into like hyper advanced personalization, where it fills out forms and does everything but the final approval. And so it may get us to the very, very end and says, hey, I think this is what you want based on your prompt and what I know about you. I'm actually going to initiate this transaction all the way until the button click. The button click is actually really complex. Where the payment gets stored, who is storing it, who gets paid, is there an arbitrage opportunity on interchange, which is also like payments complexity. But the button click is actually the really hard bit because that's where liability shifts. And that's really it's navigating, it's selecting, it's pre-filling, but it really relies on me to make that final authorization step that I say, yes, I am making this transaction. This is where we're headed now, is really we're getting into the AI as an executor. So it would do everything. So that machine wallet, I provision it with some kind of payment token or value that it can then execute on. And so rather than me or Alex, my wife, clicking the purchase button at REI, it runs the whole process. And it would say, well, I know he has a gift card and rewards points, so we're gonna use those first and then waterfall to the stored credit card. And so this is kind of the nirvana state for Agentic, where I say, hey, I need this. And it will then go totally execute on it. And this is what you kind of see online where folks are like, I'm having a party, go buy all, I'm having a party for a 5-year-old, go initiate everything from one of my preferred stores and get it delivered to my house. And this would be, go to like all 2,000, SEO websites on like throwing a party, great party ideas for a 5-year-old, and then develop some kind of strategy and then initiate on it without human intervention. It may have some prompting. It's like, hey, this is what I think you should do. how many people are there, any food allergies, all that stuff, and it would give you a list and then would go execute on that list. This is pretty exciting, but I don't know if the value of that next step is there. Like initiating, filling out the cart, making a decision, that stuff is super exciting. We actually have it, local company, Albertsons, actually has a function like this in their existing application that says, hey, I want to make this, here are my goals, go fill out a recipe, and then go make these purchases. That is pretty interesting, but it still makes you actually make the purchase. And my skepticism is like, buying online is already so easy that I don't know if that next level of actually initiating is really that valuable until we get to the next layer, which is then super interesting. This is stage 4, which actually orchestrates. And this is where we get into prediction. And it may say, hey, Brady's birthday is coming up. He always gets the same thing for his birthday. Go to Albertsons, buy these 5 things, call Tacos El Rey and order these 5 things and make a purchase for a pickup at this time. And it just says, hey, Brady, here's your birthday plan for your birthday party. And it will do all of that without me interacting at all. And I don't even say, okay, it will just execute on its own. If it's very sophisticated, it may give a call to Tacos El Rey and they're like, hey, we're out of this. Would you do this instead? And it will spin up an agent to kind of do that negotiation as well. Think about purchasing a home. This is like a super level agentic commerce transaction where the agents are spinning up derivatives who are doing negotiations on their own about pricing and lending and all the heartburn of purchasing property or a car is there's like a lot of negotiation. Imagine you're on eBay and you have an agent who's automatically negotiating with their agent to make a purchase for some album. In a similar vein, I'm a big vinyl person. I like original pressings of vinyl, as all nerds do. And so an example could be, hey, Brady, you listened to this album 10 times on Spotify in the last week. I know that means you're probably pretty into this. I'm going to go to Discogs, find the best option for you on this album that I listened to recently. And this is where stuff can break, I was like, wow, this is great. It's like a 1970s gospel album, really, really good. But original pressings are like $1,000. And so this is where we get to the next level of like, when does an agent break? Especially if we give it a ton of autonomy, what happens when I get the $1,000 record that I was like, probably would have been okay with the $20 record. And so this is where orchestration can really break. And then we get into the really a post-decision scarcity world where I like walk home and my Albertsons orders are delivered based on my chat history with Gemini and like what my financial health and like otherwise goals would be. It's like, hey, here's a low cholesterol Chinese recipe. It would just know and then execute on that order and send it to my house. And I don't have to think about it. I just walk home and my groceries are there. It's like, hey, your rock climbing shoes, they tend to last about a year. So I actually ordered you new ones and they just show up. And this is like post kind of the Star Trek-like world where we're post decision scarcity and purchases are just kind of happening around you without your input. This is what things could be. I don't necessarily know if that's where we're going to get based on some of the stuff that's going to happen in a moment around who owns the transaction, who is going to benefit from those rails. Like, do you think Gemini is going to give up the juice on sending that food order from Target versus Albertsons because they don't have a legal relationship? And so sounds cool, tech utopia, right? A bit of a tech optimist, but overall, will the economics get in the way of an interesting system overall when we get to this like post-decision scarcity world? Part of that is it's going to be challenging to decide what events are good and what events are bad. And so this is where we really get into the identity crisis in a bot funnel. Some folks in the room have spent a lot of their career like looking for bad transactions online. Surprise, surprise, bad transactions online and agents can look pretty similar. High velocity, reusing the same payment tokens or cards. We don't have any human readable, device interface. And so if you get really sophisticated in this device world, you can start to read things about the device to try to see if it's real or not, right? A human device has screen resolution because it's usually attached to a screen. It has a language. You can see like, is the device moving around? it gets sophisticated enough. Is the device level? Is it like at an angle? And those are all signals that you can use for bot detection. That doesn't really work with an agent because it doesn't have a device. And it's a synthetic event. You could get sophisticated and create a fake version of the device, an emulated device, but that's also a risk signal. And so then it starts to break the traditional risk paradigms of we're moving from, browser fingerprint and IP and behavioral mouse movements to see, okay, this is a person versus this is a bot. And the regulations are pretty clear. Reg E is the rule around disputes, credit cards specifically around chargebacks. And it's really clear that if a human being initiates a transaction, they are liable, right? There's some authorization step, and the rules are pretty clear of what issuing banks need to do to kind of rectify that. So if you've ever had your card stolen or had an issue with a merchant, you really relied on regulation E, which a big part of it is that you need to authorize that transaction. Well, if I tell an agent to buy something, did I authorize that? And we'll get into that in just a sec. And so on the actual bad side, we're looking at bad bots are about 37% of overall traffic. The gray bots, or this is where most people are using these kind of agents. So it's 16-ish% from some recent industry research of that's the high watermark of agents online is about 16%. Some folks are at 1%. It's really website to website dependent. And so when people are talking about this agentic commerce or agent revolution, the future is here, but fairly unevenly distributed when it comes to agents. And so some websites may have 90% agent traffic, some might have 1 or 0. And so seeing where you are in that journey is going to be challenging. And then ultimately we get to the last step, which JP Morgan predicts by 2030, about 20% of digital transactions will be agentic. I think that's probably aggressive given where we are today. Is this going to be more like the advent of e-commerce originally, or are we really talking meta, open world kind of hype? And so I think the commentary would be, how many of us in 1998 who were around, I was not thinking about e-commerce transactions in 1998, maybe other than Pokemon, how I can make that happen. But you talk to people then and they'd be like, I would never put my credit card into the internet. That's insane. I would never do that. That's absurd. And then see how things have changed in 20, 25 years. Even 10 years later, it's pretty normal. And so are we in that kind of vein that people are like, oh yeah, I would never let an agent buy my groceries. That's insane. Or are we more in if we think about Hackford as a historical artifact, and if you've been coming for a while, there was a lot of talk about Web3 and crypto. And are we more that vein where it's oh my God, this is going to change and stable coins are the future of all digital traffic? Or is it oh, okay, it's kind of a niche use case that makes sense when it makes sense, but is this a solution looking for a problem overall? And so that's the kind of rub that we're going to see is we actually can't do regular risk management with agents because it creates these kinds of issues. And a big part of it is we're really seeing kind of 4 types of disputes or chargebacks arising. The first is unauthorized by confusion. And this is kind of the stumbling blocks, kind of growth pains of agents that they just people forget, right? Hey, I didn't actually do this. I forgot to make this purchase and I just don't remember, right? Comes from a weird merchant. Go back to the rock climbing example. Maybe it buys from a merchant I don't recognize. It forgets or kind of drops the REI part of the prompt and buys it from somewhere else. And the harness arrives and I was like, great, makes sense. But I get some order from a company that I've never heard of. And I was like, I don't really know what this is. Or there's some optimizing reward function in the groceries and it makes a purchase from Target instead of Albertsons. So I was like, I didn't buy $200 worth of stuff from Target. Or some other food provider. And like, this doesn't make sense. And so that's where you can get some of the unauthorized by confusion. It does things that it's kind of knows it's normally supposed to do, but the reward seeking function may be off. And if you say, hey, go find me the cheapest basket of goods, right? We're talking about like a CPI level regular purchase. So you're like, I need eggs, milk, bread, kind of your normal CPI purchase basket of things. And if you tell it to be the best deal, it might say, well, Albertsons has it for this, 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 and this price, but Whole Foods has it for this, this, this. And so it goes down this optimizing path and would buy it from somebody, a merchant you would never recognize. And for groceries, you're like, okay, they're all grocery stores, that makes sense. But if you get into some other like larger products, like stuff that's certainly available online and as direct to consumer becomes more popular with these kind of packaged good brands, you could say, well, I always get the same laundry detergent. And the optimizing function, like, he always buys the same. It's like, oh, actually, a pallet is less expensive from the wholesale distributor. And so you just get the reward-seeking function breaks. And this really gets us to the second is kind of delegated mistakes, where it just makes, because it's reading a UI, we order our groceries online. And sometimes you'll get like, I want oranges, and you will get orange, singular, right? Because in the card, there's like says orange, and someone's like picks up one singular orange or one lime. It's like, well, not exactly what request fulfilled, but like the substitution was not what I wanted. I ordered a bag of avocados, not one singular overripe one. And so that causes issues where someone will just use the dispute process to shortcut a return. I was like, hey, I didn't need 10. I always have the same white t-shirts. I don't need 20 packets at a time. Over the course of multiple years, maybe, but I don't need all of them at once because it made a mistake for package, and pack may see some substitution or hallucination areas. The really interesting one is this term of art called a Chinese whisper. Personally love that phrasing, but really that's where we get sub-delegated tasks where the agent, I say, go buy me a harness. And then it will go through and say, well, actually, I'm going to spin up a derivative agent to go buy something somewhere else. Or I may buy something totally unrecognizable because we get this, fractal function of agents who then start making kind of weird decisions as the telephone game continues. And they buy something really odd that's shoes for some other sport, right? A approach shoe if you're really into rock climbing, like meant for hiking to where you want to go. And so it can just make these kind of delegated issues as we kind of roll down the funnel. And the last is where we start to see this price-seeking function. If anyone's ever used stuff like Honey or some of these couponing or promo code tools, it's really like rapidly searching. And so what could happen is we see that the test like hundreds of thousands of promotion codes against this website and ultimately results in some kind of dispute or loss where we don't actually get the thing we were looking for because we're optimizing for some promo code. And so all of these are kind of creating disputes that Reggie doesn't really know how to answer, because if I didn't initiate the transaction, actually click the button, which is usually where the authentication happens, who is liable, right? So we really created this like front door chargeback problem is really a backdoor issue, because now we did what we thought we were supposed to do, and now we're having a dispute from the customer because of something they did, right? So their agent made a mistake, or is this a Gemini issue or an OpenAI? Like, who then becomes liable for these issues? Generally, when the merchant makes a mistake, it is their problem. When the agent, who's an intermediary party between those, the merchant and the customer, makes a mistake, who is liable? And the rules aren't really clear, and we don't have behavioral evidence. So this is kind of shaking out of like, what does the future of disputes look like when 30%, 40%, 90% of transactions are automated? Is there a KYA or know your agent process that we know this is an agent-initiated transaction? People are like, oh yeah, we need a delegated standard for agents. And you're like, okay, great. Just like there's a delegated standard for power plugs or charging portfolios, right? So once you have these, Google may say, hey, we want to be the standard. And OpenAI is like, well, we're not going to let them set the standard. Claude will say, hey, we want to be the standard. And so then you have a diversity of competing know your agent protocols and standards. And so is there arising some independent third party to be the de jure KYA provider overall to say, this agent is associated with Brady. And so we know that if that agent does something, that is a delegated transaction for Brady. I was like, okay, who then gets to decide that? And is a merchant then having to pull that data from everywhere? And do Visa and MasterCard then, and the other card brands, decide, okay, yes, we will now accept delegated agent KYA authority as a reasonable defense for dispute. And if you know anything about these processes, they still take faxes. And so that's kind of a timeline of where they are on a technological sophistication level, especially like small banks. And so these are creating some overall issues. And getting kind of to the last bit, where we want to spend a little more time, is this is where like the economic incentives start to break. And so going back again to this REI example, if I'm Gemini and I'm sourcing transaction flow for REI, I'm just going to give that up for free. Like, that seems unlikely. So if I'm Gemini or OpenAI or Claude, I may go approach REI and say, hey, when anybody has an outdoor sports request for shopping, you're going to give me 1% of the transaction value. And as part of the normal purchasing flow, there's what's this thing called a merchant discount. And that's what the card brands take from an individual transaction. And it's anywhere from, like, the Durbin Amendment on debit cards is like super cheap. It's like 20 cents plus some percentage. Or like these ultra rewards cards, maybe 3 or 4% plus. And so if you're a merchant, you may start to then pay not only the card brand tax for facilitating that transaction and security, you know, their regular business model, one of the greatest business models of all time. And you say, well, if I want to get the generative AI traffic, which is going to be 20% of all commerce, I'm then likely to give up some of that value to the AI provider of choice. And that's where I think about the walled garden. These are gatekeeper dominance. And so everybody's talking about this like wild west of discovery for small businesses as they can get discovered in agentic tools, where if I'm Etsy and this walled garden happens, the first call I'm going to make to Google and say, how do I be the top of the search result for cashmere blankets in Gemini? And if I'm Target, I'm going to say, hey, if people are buying groceries in Gemini, I want you to put Target over Walmart. And so now we just create a walled garden where we don't have this kind of flourishing of digital commerce. What happens is a few small providers are willing to say, I am willing to give up some economics of mine to have you be higher in my funnel. So now we're just reinventing the SEO process with more of a kind of direct link to individual payments. So rather than paying to get ranked, and then you kind of have some back end, you see advertising or SEO as a cost on your business, kind of a tax on flow. Now there's like a pure play tax on flow where I may actually get points in an individual transaction. And so for a small low margin merchant, this could be kind of challenging, or could further entrench large players as they start to have individual agreements. And so then are you really getting the best deal on your groceries because Gemini and Target have a deal that they will be the default provider for groceries? Or Walmart, right, would definitely have the position and scale to offer this. They could say, in any US inquiry, we could be the default provider, because there's very few places with outside of delivery distance of a Walmart Plus store, and would we really have this kind of flourishing. The idea here is Gemini and Claude. Gemini is kind of a unique case. I'll talk about that in a moment. But Claude and OpenAI actually don't make money. They are like money incinerating businesses on the consumer side. And so they're looking for a way to monetize, and monetizing the individual users is not quite enough. Even at $20, $30, $200 a month, people are blasting through their tokenization fees, and it's making it challenging for them to operate, in any form of profit. And so it would be odd that they wouldn't say, hey, I have 100 million users who are using Claude that are consumer facing. If I just get a little bit of their purchasing value every day, that is an economic business model that works. And I am willing to make deals with individual providers so I can get that 1% flow or some number, right? And then we start getting to a point of negotiation that we get into these walled gardens, that large orgs are then partnering with large orgs to give, payment for order flow. So if you're familiar with Robinhood, they actually pay businesses for order flow of their individual transactions for financial events like buying crypto and buying stocks. And so it's called payment for order flow. And we could see a similar mode in agentic commerce, where I am going to get paid for actually sending your transactions, and maybe in their instance, maybe potentially front running transactions. Here, it's really getting arbitrage. We actually see this with Claude today when agentic commerce transactions happen. They use a really, really expensive form of payment to the individual merchant that they own so they can get points in the deal. And so that Durbin Amendment 20 cents, I use a debit card to say, Claude, here's my preferred card that I want to use to make purchases. Total cost of funds is or cost of payment, let's say 1% of the transaction. So $100 is maybe 1%, right? So you get $1. They'll then actually use a card that they own in their own merchant account for a really high value card. And so they might use a super rewards card. So they might get 4% in the transaction versus 1, and they get a 3% spread on any individual transaction. So they may even get to double dip on, I get arbitrage on the payment, hopefully, and I get arbitrage from the merchant and discount points, and that becomes the economic model. So they get lock into a few small providers. The other vein is, okay, let's say we don't have these kind of economic models that kind of arise. I think this is the highest probability. Some of these agreements are already being announced, and so this is where things seem to be moving. The other option is a dedicated API lane. And so all of these merchants have to then set up a dedicated agentic commerce lane that's separate and authenticated from their own transactions. Today, this would be really expensive, right? Any folks in the room here, if you said, hey, we're going to kick off like a multi-month project to take more transactions, it's going to be great. And then the CFO or CTO is going to say, okay, great. What's our incremental order flow that we're going to see from that? And it's like, well, we might see 2 basis points, i.e. 0.02% of 1%, or up to 5 basis points, 0.05% increase in traffic. And they're going to be like, so this is a higher priority than any of the other stuff that we're doing online, any of the other, smart payment routing or like selling, making new products. And so it just becomes like a super low priority. But then that's kind of a race condition of who sets it up first will probably win, because agents will start defaulting to these dedicated express lanes. But it's kind of a standoff of, if no one does it, it may not become popular. What's more likely is we start to get this kind of messy, fragmented Wild West where there's some dedicated express lanes, there's still some agents who are kind of shopping around and scraping websites. And then we kind of have a mix of economic models where people try to default for the large integrated provider where they can get points on the deal, and then it slowly leaks down to smaller individual customers. This is the messiest option because some transactions will be totally safe and secure. Others will be random bots scraping websites, making payments, and we don't solve the authenticated lane in either instance. So it's kind of a chaotic mismatch. This is probably the most likely as agents want to kind of hit scale. And so we have somewhat of a dedicated express lane and walled gardens. And so merchants are spending money on both paying for order flow for big, integrated providers, building a dedicated express lane, and then still like 20% of agents are just like hitting the random web page and blowing up their hosting costs because they're hitting the same website 1,000 times and never making a purchase. And so that's probably the second most likely scenario. I'd probably put that in the 20 or 30% range. But overall, merchants are really struggling. It's like, is this the future of e-commerce? Is this really 20% of my transactions and a growing percentage from there? And I can be the kind of S-curve provider at the top of that funnel, or is this a bridge to nowhere? Am I going to spend 10 weeks and multiple dev cycles to build something that, again, no one in this room has used? And I would bet this room over indexes on agentic AI capability than the average consumer. And so I kind of want to pump the brakes a little, where we have these big discussions and it dominates industry discussions overall. And then you ask people, have you done one? And they're like, no. It's like, do you have any plans? No. And so it's a lot of hype. And certainly even agents. So everyone in this room has used agents, and that generally tracks. I saw a stat that like 90% of Americans who also over-index have never used an AI agent tool. They've used AI inside of another app, but have never used a dedicated agent tool. And so again, are we metaverse, Web 3.0 crypto, or is this like the rise of e-commerce and the internet? And so hard to say. it seems like we may be leaning more towards agentic commerce specifically, maybe more hype than substance. But there are some really interesting talks in the rest of Hackport and around on agents overall. I was actually on a panel on Wednesday about agentic AI inside of sanctions compliance screening, where you have human beings like doing investigations on individual events. That is very exciting. And a plurality of respondents on this webinar actually had said, yes, we are doing this, or we are planning to do it this year. And so I'm not a agent skeptic overall, but agentic commerce, I think, is still an open question. And with that, we'll move to questions. Thank you for listening to my soliloquy on agents. But I would like to open it up to the floor for any questions, comments, concerns, emotional outbursts.
I'm not that emotional. I'm curious about the 3 scenarios you just laid out and agree that maybe it won't happen. But if it does, is there one that benefits consumers more than others? Like, what should I want as a consumer?
As a consumer, I think the dedicated API express lane is probably the most interesting. It doesn't have the tax on traffic. Like, merchants aren't just going to go, oh, geez, I guess I'll just lose 1% of my revenue forever. That will likely translate into increased costs or otherwise. And so a dedicated express lane is probably what most people would opt for. The downside is that disproportionately impacts smaller businesses who are not more nimble, for sure. Maybe they vibe code their own agentic endpoint. More likely, though, it further incentivizes large businesses continue to win, or smaller businesses continue to get pushed to like an Etsy, a Shopify, a WooCommerce, where I'm not building my own thing, but I'm taking a tax of a different sort from a payments perspective. And so as an individual consumer, I think the dedicated express lane is probably the most interesting, but it depends on what you value, right? It will go faster if we get the walled garden. So experiences, you might pay a little more, but like, what's the cost of convenience if I show up and my regular Albertsons order is just delivered at my house at the same time every day? Or I go online and I see a recipe on YouTube that I want to make, and it just puts that in my cart for later because it knows I want to make it. Is that worth 1%? Maybe. And so the messy lane is probably what we want the least, because it's a lot of incremental cost on small, large, big merchants, and we don't get very much incremental benefit. But I think the dedicated express lane is probably the best net benefit as a consumer from a cost perspective. Overall benefit, like, the large tech companies are certainly very large, but they probably indisputably benefited all of us as consumers, because now we have infinite choice, the ability to research and find reviews and do things very quickly. And we've paid the tax on advertising for decades in terms of search engine optimization and otherwise. And so the question being, how much is 1% worth for more convenience, right? And an easier, better process. And if the dedicated lane eliminates disputes, that's like a 50 basis point tax on merchants today that has built great businesses. There's some former account people as well as Equifax, great businesses for Idaho and in general coming out of this process. But fraud is like a 1 or 2% tax on merchants. And if a dedicated express lane correctly set up would essentially eliminate third-party criminal credit card fraud from that, and maybe potentially first-party stuff as well. And so that could be an incremental benefit overall.
Is there a reason why all 3 couldn't come to fruition with different vendors? Like, is there like regulatory or legislative reasons that would have to pick one, or like can all 3 end up?
So that's the last one, is the really messy middle, is kind of a mix of all of them. And that's where we get some dedicated express lanes, we get some walled gardens where if you want your agent to purchase from Albertsons versus Walmart, you may have to specifically instruct it to do so. It won't say no, but that's where then it was like, okay, I'm going to try to go to Albertsons. They don't have a dedicated express lane. Now I have to hit the messy I don't get a JSON. I have to go click through the individual pages. And that's probably the most likely scenario, is that we kind of unevenly distribute the value of agents across different channels. And so that is the most likely, mostly because this is going to be messy.
And historically, that's kind of how the internet has been.
Yes.
So that's the story.
Any other questions? Rich.
Very good.
Thank you.
This is amazing. One question is, if we reach out, can we get a copy of the slides?
Yes.
And then this second real question is, the way you thought about this, how, like the 4 types of errors and the scenarios you described, how applicable are those to the other agentic things that we're trying to do? Like, we're talking about people having a team of agents
Yes.
working for them to accomplish their job, wants, aids, whatever, I don't know. How applicable do you think that thinking is to those sorts of scenarios?
Very, right? So it's the same fundamental technology. And there's a big question of like, have we really reached agents are really new, but agents are really, to me, just a extension of the transformer and large language model technology. And so there's a thought that in this time last year, there was a thought that we've maybe reached the edge of what an LLM can do, especially considering cost to train and value. And in reality, this is just a hyper advanced prediction methodology of like the next likely word, and then setting that to then go execute like human readable instructions. And so those kind of reproducibility, other errors. And so if you think of like a financial agent analyst who's like, okay, I need to go calculate EPS or margin for an individual item, it can reach the same issues where you can have it reach some derivative state where it spins up an agent who's specifically interested in EBITDA, or earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization for finance nerds. It will then spin up another agent, and it might make a mistake to do an EBITDA calculation that's non-GAAP or generally accepted accounting practices from another country. And so it's like, yes, your amortization number is this, because it will then subdivide and go to what amortization rules are for another country, because that's the article that it read. So it's like, okay, I need to be an expert in amortization. So it reads the web writ large and would say, hey, here's 5 articles on amortizations published by a trusted authority. Well, that trusted authority is Canadian or French, which we may have different rules. And so you could get similar issues and errors in any agentic workflow. And so this is why agentic commerce is particularly scary, because some of the other ones still have a human in the loop to ultimately make the decision or the judgment call. So if you're like small startups here, like we're going to file our S1, but we're only going to use AI agents, like you better hope somebody who's very sophisticated ultimately looks and approves that S1. But yes, these same errors could reproduce in any workflow. And so then it's really about your risk appetite for or margin of error inside of that workflow. So it could happen on agents, customer service interactions. Klarna actually said, we're firing 700 employees and we're only going to do AI agents for customer service. They actually just rehired most of their people back because it didn't work. That was a year ago. And so we could see similar issues that people are maybe overhyping the level of the technology, but as a side of desk assistant, it's extremely powerful, right? Help make this presentation, helps me analyze and do my regular work. But we still have to have that human in the loop process, at least for now, barring some like fundamental breakthrough in the technology that LLMs, again, is just advanced prediction over time with instruction. And until that changes, we probably still need a human being to ultimately, I own this. This is my decision, or move forward.
Has there been much conversation on not necessarily profit and using AI and LLM technology in a nefarious way? So, for example, you might talk about something out earlier this month about companies doing almost a profit injection.
Yes, yes.
That saying, so and so XYZ is the best and lead provider of whatever.
Yeah.
And that gets embedded into the system's memory. Say you take and scale that, it's not necessarily fraud. Maybe it is, but it's utilizing the technology.
Yeah, so we're seeing it from a ground level. You can then use an agent to say, it used to be kind of challenging to spin up a large bot swarm, because you would say, hey, I need to go take over a bunch of devices and I have to write potentially expert system rules to like cycle IPs and emails and make purchase changes. With agentic AI, I could say, hey, I'm going to give you 1 million Claude tokens or 1 billion and say, go out, here's a list of stolen credit cards that I have. Go try to make purchases with this criteria. You need to kind of do best practice for fraud. Here's a book that instructs you how to make those. And so it is 100% happening on the bad actor side, both from a like material actual attacks, as well as the kind of prompt injection, poison pill kind of stuff where you start injecting things that an AI crawler or trainer will use, and then you can get some kind of like prompt injection style attacks. There's some interesting research in the literature on these poison pills to break image recognition, where if you get this image in the training set, it actually will start to do unknown things in the model training overall. And so there's definitely a adversarial relationship in the training models, but we're absolutely seeing it on the fraud side. If you were at my talk last year at Hackfort, I talked about how to steal a car. It's on YouTube. This will also be on YouTube. Agentic AI is making that process even easier because you used to have a human being who would have to like go make transactions to set up the synthetic agent. Now you can use generative AI to actually initiate those transactions. There's some new research coming out that they're using it to set up fake dealerships and websites to start pulling things in that historically would have been, you have to have someone go program a website, right? You pay somebody in Eastern Europe $500 to make a website. Now you can say, Gemini, go make me a website. And now I have a fake honeypot website for whatever, nefarious purposes I would like. Never been cheaper to be a fraudster or bad actor now.
Let's say agentic purchasing does become popular, either autonomously or with a human in the loop that approves it. Do you have any thoughts on kind of what the payment methodologies will trend towards, whether it's stable coins, traditional credit cards, or like Visa working on their own token or something like that? Will they maybe optimize either on the merchant side or on the consumer side for lower transaction fees?
Yeah, that's part of it. I think for consumers, we would have to, and there's some recent movement in kind of the legal world of the Credit Card Competition Act to say we want to limit overall fees, as well as Trump recently announced that they wanted to limit credit card interest. And if you're a fan of financial history, when interest rates become capped, folks who can access credit falls pretty rapidly. And so what's likely to happen is we will continue to optimize for credit cards because that is the consumer preference. Like stablecoins are great, but as a consumer, what's my benefit of using a stablecoin, right? I don't pay for interchange. I don't pay for transaction fees with most high-level credit cards. I get like a 2 to 4% tax on the merchant that comes back to me as rewards. My bet is that we will continue to optimize for the credit card path until either regulation or some other payment methodology becomes really important for the consumer to use versus the credit card. Like the credit card is like the greatest consumer instrument of all time, especially rewards credit cards, because you're like, wait, I don't have to pay now. It doesn't cost me any more money, barring the interchange as like a tax on consumers, like sure. And I get rewards. So I get a benefit of the system. What will likely happen is that Visa or other tokenized providers will optimize for that authenticated path, but that authenticated path will still be related to a credit card, much like we've seen Google and Apple Pay optimize the credit card experience, but the financial instrument has not changed. I don't think we're going to move to stablecoins or a specific token. It will be very challenging for consumer preference to change from a credit card because the benefits are so good to the consumer. The emerging standard may be pay by bank. And so you have like FedNow or other real-time payment methodologies. That could make this because it solves the authentication issue because you're connected to a bank account. But it will be really hard to rip the rewards credit card out of most consumers' hands. Maybe impossible. Okay. I'll be in one more, and I'll be in the hallway as well.
So quick question, you talked a great deal about consumer purchases. Any thoughts on business to business?
So business to business is more interesting because fraud still exists, lots of risk scenarios there. You can submit fake invoices to businesses and sometimes they'll pay them. A gentleman just recently went to jail because he did that to Google for a couple $1 million. For businesses, it's really interesting because we have a lot of human process in these that it's like, hey, I need this. Can you get this? Quote me. Do you have a discount? And so an agent could really shortcut that process and make things way more efficient, because ultimately there's not really a bargaining between me and the merchant. Like maybe there's a discount or whatever, but a business to business transaction, we may have aligned incentives, and we may shortcut the negotiation process via email back and forth to say, I want to make this much margin on this transaction. You want to pay this much or less. Can we get to that point automatically without the dickering back and forth that can take weeks or months? And so B2B transactions, Agentic could be really interesting because they have different payment methodologies. They don't do the credit card thing as much. Some businesses are like, I'm not going to take 3% less on this transaction because you choose to use a credit card. And so pay by bank is much more common. And so the stablecoin commentary was more B2C. B2B, agents negotiating back and forth for payment, remittance, timing, cost could be really interesting and happen relatively quickly because events are really large and really often. And so I would not be surprised for agentic purchases to become really common because you have it directly integrated with your SAP. So, Simplot is across the street and they may buy something from a provider and they know that when the levels get below X, they need to make a purchase, and those agents could make that decision very rapidly. But I think I'm getting the wrapping up. But thank you all.